Hi, Michael Alvarez, Caltech's Flintridge Foundation Professor of Political and Computational Social Science, and one of the two co-directors of the Lynn Center for Science, Society, and Policy. I'm really excited today to have this opportunity to talk with Danny Ebanks. Danny is currently working at Harvard, where he's a research scientist associate.
Scientist associate.
Yep. At Harvard's IQSS program, and we'll talk a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
Danny was a PhD student here at Caltech, and I got to know him quite well during that period, and we're continuing our collaboration. So thanks, Danny, for being here today.
No, thanks, Mike, for inviting me, and I'm really excited to partake in this conversation and to talk a little bit more about our research and about all these great projects we're working on.
Well, let's start there. Let's talk a little bit about your research agenda. So how do you characterize the kind of work that you're doing?
Oh, that's a great question. So I would say that my work follows along two dimensions. So there's a methodological dimension and a substantive dimension. On the methods side, I work, again, in two areas. So one is thinking about large unstructured data and how can we uncover the latent structure that exists underneath it. So these are some of the deep learning, advanced ML methods where we'll be working with lots of computation to extract out of the sort of large unstructured data that's generated, whether it's on social media, through congressional speeches. We're looking to find that the underlying structure that basically gives us more insight into what's going on, whether it's politically or behaviorally, with respect to these really interesting areas where a lot of the political action is happening these days. Additionally, I actually work almost the opposite on highly structured data. So take congressional elections, where we sort of know the structure, and the question is less about how do we uncover it and more how do we model it. So we'll work with advanced Bayesian hierarchical models to think about how to forecast elections. And then from that forecast, how do we see something interesting, novel, or important about the universals of elections? Like what are sort of the universal constants, the underlying, again, similarly, what is the underlying sort of technical structure that explains how American elections work in the modern era? Now, on the second dimension, substance, I again have sort of broad interests. I work on American politics broadly, but in particular, I think a lot about how partisanship and polarization interact with our institutions. So obviously electoral institutions, congressional institutions are sort of my political interest. And then I also think a lot about kind of more generic societal institutions, such as our scientists, our research centers, our universities, and how politics interacts and has an interplay with these sort of long-standing, almost apolitical, we think of, generally speaking, as apolitical institutions, how those interact as well.
Well, let's start with the politics and election side, because, of course, we're in the middle of an election season. Here in California, the primaries are just, weeks away. We've got the general election coming up in a bit. So, and I know part of the research that you do on elections and congressional elections in particular is with my colleagues, Jonathan Katz and Gary King at Harvard.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about the work you're doing with Jonathan Gary.
Okay, of course, that work is really exciting because I think we've been working for many, many years, almost, I think, since my second year of graduate school, so that's like 8 years ago now. We've been working to figure out how do we model and forecast elections in such a way that is valid, that is well calibrated. Well, the term we use is generatively accurate. So most folks have heard of generative AI. Think of this as sort of generative elections. Mm-hmm. And so can we generate out-of-sample predictions about elections that are accurate? Now, as political scientists, we don't necessarily care about the forecast, in and of itself. If we want to know who's going to win the election, we wait a few days, they'll count the votes, and a winner will be announced. What we really want to know is, how do we expose ourselves to being wrong? How do we say that, when we go out there to make some pronouncement about American politics, what is our standard for correctness? And the standard that we argue for is generative accuracy and calibration. So if we say that an election has a 95% probability of occurring, that's actually true. Mm-hmm. A lot of the standard models and pundits and folks like that are sort of commenting online, their models they'll make plenty of forecasts, and if you were actually to hold them to this standard, you would actually find their forecasts are off by orders of magnitude of 1 in a million events happening all the time. Mm-hmm. We actually hold ourselves to a much stricter standard than that.
So let me just ask you though, so is this a way to correct, for example, the misconceptions that people had about the accuracy of election forecasts in like the 2016 presidential election? It's a different context, but is that what you're trying to solve?
Now we're focused particularly on the congressional context with these models, but I agree that this is exactly what we're trying to do, is to say, the sort of notion from computer science, for example, that we really latched onto is less about the sort of sophisticated modeling and more about their validation metrics, thinking about out-of-sample forecasting, thinking about how these predictions that we make actually turn up in reality, and thinking about sort of tail events. So when we think about black swan events, tail events, stock market prices, you could use these sort of models for those sorts of events. It's characterizing, less characterizing, the average, sort of, and more thinking about the variance. Are we actually, we know what we don't know, and are we characterizing that part correctly? So that's what we're really focused on, really characterizing the uncertainty and the known unknowns correctly.
So in the end, is the answer that there's more uncertainty in these forecasts than you might expect, or less?
So interestingly enough, it depends on where you are in the forecast space. So if you're in the sort of highly competitive elections, the elections that we really care about, that are going to sort of turn on who controls Congress, those elections are going to have lots of uncertainty. It turns out from year to year, the set of seats that are competitive and that really determine who's going to be Speaker of the House and what legislation will be passed and who's going to be appointed to the Supreme Court, those elections, the salient elections, are very unpredictable. Now, lots of elections are highly predictable. So elections that are uncontested, we know who's going to win with probability 1. Elections where the incumbent usually receives 70, 80% of the vote, we know those are going to be uncompetitive, and they're very easy to forecast. So it's exactly in those interesting elections, the ones that we really care about, that we're focused on. And yes, those are going to be more uncertain.
So we're in one of those elections right now.
That's right.
And you and I actually have just worked on a paper to talk about the context that we're currently in, in terms of what we kind of think of as the midterm voter,
That's
right?
right.
And
That's right.
as we go into this election cycle. So what have we found in that paper?
So in this particular paper, we were looking at long-run survey evidence of voters' perceptions and voters' stated preferences with respect to the congressional ballot. So we basically, in these surveys, we ask voters, who do you prefer, a Democrat or Republican, in your vote for Congress? We have about 5 years of data going back to basically to the start of the COVID era. And so from COVID through the 2022 midterm elections, the Dobbs decision, the recent Iran war, the October 7th attacks in Israel, just all sorts of events we've been tracking all along. Who is your preference for control of Congress? And interestingly enough, we find remarkable stability, that it's basically a 50-50 electorate through all of these events. So despite all of the changes, all of the swings in the stock market, the change in geopolitical events, public health, the change over in presidential administration, all of this has been extraordinarily sort of almost orthogonal to voters' preferences, which have stayed exactly the same. It's about a 50-50 electorate. What's interesting about this is it actually does dovetail nicely with some of the work with Gary and Jonathan, where we find that this pattern, looking at observed congressional elections, looking at the forecast probability of incumbent defeat, that pattern hasn't just been stable since COVID. That's been stable since World War II. And so we find about a 1 in 5 chance that incumbents are going to find themselves in a competitive election over that 75-year period. This survey evidence shows sort of, if you think of the probability of incumbent defeat as sort of a supply side, the sort of supply of politicians is sort of at a sort of constant level of competition. The survey evidence gives us the demand side and shows that also voters' preferences are quite stable. And I think that goes against what most folks think about, that when you watch the news, if you turn on CNN or Fox News, you look at social media, TikTok, you see all this notion of chaos and instability and sort of radical shifts back and forth, and there's momentum. And really what we find across two different streams of evidence, or really qualitatively different streams of evidence, is this same stability. And it goes back a very, very long time, not just 6 years, but even back 70 years. And I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's a super interesting finding.
Right.
And I know you and I have talked about this before, to just slightly change the subject, but we both have encountered people who, when you talk about this kind of work, and gosh, the passion that you have for this is just amazing. You talk about this work, and a lot of people will say, gosh, I didn't know people at Caltech did that kind of work.
Yes,
right?
we face this all the time.
So how do you react to that when someone says, I didn't know people at Caltech did. What's unique about Caltech with respect to the kind of work that you're doing in political science?
I think when folks think of Caltech, the sort of first thought that comes to mind, the first image is going to be Big Bang Theory. And just to give a little flavor here, when I started my first year of graduate school, my roommates were a physicist, a mathematician, and a quantum chemist. So I don't even know what that is. So these, that is the sort of traditional Caltech student. And of course they're like, well, Danny, what do? You do economics. Like, are you, do you even work with numbers? I was like, well, of course I'm working with numbers. And we're thinking about these highly technical problems. And what Caltech enables us to do in a truly, truly unique way as social scientists is access that technical know-how and work with our colleagues in the physical sciences, in computer science, in working with quantum computing or these sort of advanced mathematical concepts. We get to interact with them directly. And we each bring, I think, sort of really interesting, we'll call them sort of collaborative facilities to this enterprise. So we bring substantive knowledge about how people work, which is, I think, often our friends in the physical sciences, they struggle to think about to how to model humans. They've modeled particles, they've modeled gravity, but they've never actually modeled human behavior. We bring this sort of know-how about how to model human behavior to bear. They, of course, bring access to all sorts of technical tools and toolkits that we've never thought of. And we can bring those together into an interdisciplinary enterprise that I think just makes for really amazing research. And just to give an example of this, we actually worked with soil sciences. So these are geophysicists over in our friends in the lab next door over here. And they were very interested in hydrology and the dynamics of rivers. And, we sort of enter the room and they say, wait, what do you guys know about? And I say, well, actually, we know a lot about sampling uncertainty and thinking about measurement error and how we can sort of exploit some of what we think of as flaws in the science to actually make even better science. And I think they're very surprised by that. And of course, we can tell them how folks are interacting. They have sort of a mental model of how folks are thinking about their science. And we have to bring some data to that, and and put it in the language that they understand. Like, here's some hypotheses, here's some theory, here's empirical tests of your notions of how people are thinking about your science, and here's how we can get people to be, maybe have more buy-in into the science that you're conducting.
So another important stream of your research really looks at especially congressional speech and congressional rhetoric and speeches and interactions among members of Congress.
That's right.
And it's actually it's got this interdisciplinary flair to it, right? So can you talk a little bit about that? I know you had a previous video explainer that's online now that people can dig into some of the details on. But how did that kind of project evolve, and how did you proceed with working on trying to understand how members of Congress speak to each other?
That's right. So it actually started off as another project in my second year of graduate school. So this is basically, you start graduate school, and by your second year you start to generate all of these project ideas, and then you stick with them for the next decade. And so it started off as looking at social media data from congressional members of Congress, and looking at how they were interacting online, thinking about how certain emotions were being inflected and what messages were sort of pervading through the online space. And what we were interested in was to see, well, are these members of Congress just sort of lemmings for the leadership? Or are they just following the leader and just going off of whatever at the time I think it was Paul Ryan was the Speaker of the House? Are they just sort of just following their leaders? Or is it more of a grassroots kind of movement where the members of Congress are telling their leaders where to go? And actually we had a sort of a follow-on there where we thought is actually the media that's driving all of the agenda. So is it really the sort of pundits online, or I guess now the pundits on social media, are they what's driving the conversation? And we're looking at this sort of basically tripartite network to see who is actually the true driver of conversation online and of the messaging that we're all reading in the newspaper every day. From there, of course, social media data only goes back so far, and I've had a long-standing interest in history, and so I said, well, we need even more data. So where are we going to get more data? Let's go to the congressional record. Now, this data is very large. It's 14 million speeches going back to 1877. And do we observe these same patterns of congressional interactions between the leaders and the members of Congress? The answer turns out to be yes. These are, again, long-standing patterns. We find, again, this sort of long-standing stability over time. Now, of course, to process 14 million speeches, standard methods aren't always going to work. So then I sat down with our collaborators over in the computer science department, and we sort of asked each other, well, what tools are available The answer was there were none, so we had to make some. And so we sat down together, and I actually started a collaboration with a freshman here at Caltech, freshman at the time, now she's a third-year graduate student at Harvard. We worked together for 7 years. We built up a method, and wrote a software for that method that actually processes those 14 million speeches and gives us, like I was saying, kind of at the jump, about all the structure that's going on in the speeches going on in Congress on the floor.
Yeah, and that's the Caltech technical side of it.
That's where the Caltech
right?
technical is. And just to be specific there, we worked with tensor eigenvalue decomposition. The idea here was to project this very large text object and project it down into a smaller dimensional space that we that we can actually interpret it. Since we're humans, we have to be able to interpret this in some way. This gives us a chance to interpret it in an intelligible way.
Right. And one of the things I think is fun to hear about that story, of course, is your collaboration.
Yes.
And one of the things that I've always just found really remarkable about you and your approach to developing these questions and figuring out a research strategy is how you bring in to your research as a graduate student, and now, of course, at Harvard, you bring into your research undergraduates,
Yes.
fellow graduate students. So why has that been important for you over the last, I guess, 7 years since you started that collaboration,
Yes.
right?
Right, and so when I find a new collaborator, I really enjoy working with junior collaborators, and I think that does. I think that's a unique viewpoint. I think most folks view junior collaborators as folks that you have to kind of slow down for. You have to, expect that there are going to be all these sorts of mistakes, and it's going to basically slow down the research enterprise. And in some sense, it's like, why don't we all switch to agents, right? That's kind of where folks are going with this. I take a different stance on this particular issue. So, first of all, I think when you collaborate with juniors, they have a very fresh set of eyes when it comes to a problem. And when you kind of speak to a junior scholar or a new student kind of like at the same level, they're going to be very honest with you and tell you, I don't think that's the right approach. Like, and when you say, well, that's how the literature does it, they'll say, well, why? Because they're not sort of trained yet to think in only one narrow way. They're super open-minded. They're thinking very broadly, and they're going to notice problems that because when you start working on problems for 7 years straight, you start to get set in your ways, and so you miss an obvious blind spot. And they'll point that out to you almost immediately. And it's just really exciting because then you can actually fix it. And I've always enjoyed kind of the process of going from knowledge consumer to knowledge producer. And I think undergrads, when they sort of get that experience too, and they, we can kind of share in that excitement of finding out something that no one's ever known before. And that's what makes research so exciting, as opposed to sort of sitting in a class and doing a problem set, right? Most of us have that skill. That's how we got to graduate school. But that transition over to actually finding evidence, supporting new claims, thinking about an interesting question, like that part's really exciting and just requires person-to-person interaction. As far as I can tell, it's just very hard to sit there either by yourself or with a computer and come up with new ideas without actually sort of. There's almost called an emotional component, the passion, right? When you start sharing your research interest with another person, you sort of develop it together. It's just very, very exciting.
Yeah, your passion is just obvious, right?
Yeah.
and it's infectious too, and it's been fun to watch you over the years as you develop these collaborations and to just see how you build these working relationships with just all sorts of different people. The thing about it, what you just said, that I think is really remarkable about your approach, and I think why it's been so successful, is that when you're working with these undergraduates especially, you're approaching them as collaborators and peers, right?
That's right.
You're sitting there and you're talking with them about the research part. It's not a pedagogical exercise, right? And it's really sitting down and talking with them as peers. And I think that's been so valuable for you and for the students who've worked with you.
And it's interesting because graduate school is a bit of an apprenticeship. You learn from your mentors how to become a great scholar. And to be frank, the behavior I'm mirroring, of course, is yours. Mike, you run this amazing lab with 12, a dozen undergrads, maybe a half a dozen graduate students, and maybe a quarter dozen postdocs, and even folks who have graduated come back to keep working in that lab because it's such a positive collaborative space. And I think in academia, having those spaces where we can all sort of share our ideas, where folks aren't sort of trying to shoot everyone down, to show off how smart they are. We're really all there for the same mission, which is to, do great science. And I think that approach is just, it's stuck with me all these years. I've seen how well it worked for you, of course, and I say, well, I'll adopt what works. This is great. And Mike, you've always been the same way. You always talk to us like we're equals, like we, you know, me and all of the sort of students who've worked with you over the years. I know this is true. And, you know, it's just a great philosophy, I think, for training students.
Thank you.
Yes.
And then let's talk about, so you said great science, right?
Yeah.
So how, I know you're doing a lot of work on this these days, trying to figure out how great scientists can communicate their science, right?
That's right.
And I think the crucial thing is that we know that better communication of science leads to more public trust.
That's right.
In the work that we do, and in the institutions like Caltech.
That's right.
So how did you get interested in studying this idea of trust in science and scientific communications?
That's a really great question, and it starts, actually, basically my formative, you know, as a kid, I really loved space. I loved NASA and space travel and astronomy, and I always thought I was going to, at some point, become an astronomer. I mean, I've sort of veered off, but but I thought that the way that scientists were communicating about space science was just so exciting, and it was, you could see their passion and how much they cared for the mission. And as I sort of made my way through school and made my way through college, I realized, like, you know, there's so much great science going on, not just in astronomy, but all across the board, whether it's computer science with artificial intelligence, whether it's the geophysical sciences, where they're thinking a lot about climate change, whether it's the social sciences, where we're thinking about politics writ large. I think all of these topics are so interesting. And in my own life, you know, when I try to communicate to just, you know, basically to folks who are not trained technically, and I realized, wait, how do I explain this? How is, you know, what is the appropriate way to communicate this and not sound condescending, more or less? Like, when I want to approach scientific communication, I think there's a tendency to lean back on jargon or to, you know, maybe lean on your credentials a little bit. And that's, you're never going to convince anybody of what you've done by reverting to those kinds of heuristics. I think the most important aspect, again, is to find a way to communicate what you've done, and then speak to people in plain language, in language that you know that they can understand. And everyone, you know, everyone can partake in this sort of scientific enterprise. It doesn't have to be sort of limited to the halls of the lab where we keep all of the knowledge gate-kept so that no one else has access. The whole point of the enterprise is to share with everyone and to bring everyone over to our ways of thinking and show them our ways of thinking and really convince them. You know, and I think we can. I think that's what our specialty really is. And we spend so much time convincing each other, we forget we also have to go out and convince the public.
So this is where we can talk about soil science again, right?
Yes.
So I think the one thing, we've done a whole series of research projects now on trying to understand trust in science and people's trust and the credibility that they have for the scientific institutions like Caltech. But the problem that we face today is that in American politics in particular, pretty much every aspect of public opinion and political behavior is deeply intertwined with partisanship today.
That's right.
And so when you start talking to people about your science, whatever the kind of science it is, a lot of times they're just thinking, okay, this guy's a liberal. He's probably a Democrat. I'm not going to trust that because I don't trust in what liberals and Democrats say. So first off, how do you measure that? And second of all, what can you do to kind of counteract that?
That's right. So I think we've focused a lot on a number of survey experiments since about 2022, thinking about exactly this question. How do we measure the extent to which folks really do just trust the science through this partisan lens? So the way we got at this was sort of, we went back to our friends, the geophysicists, and we borrowed one of their soil science studies. And so they were talking about the age of certain chemicals in the soil, and they wanted to know, and they had some interesting evidence. And we basically took that study and asked folks about it. We said, well, do you trust this? And just yes or no. And if it came from us, we say, did it come from a scientist? Did it come from a person? Or did it come from a Democratic scientist or a Democratic person? Or a Republican scientist or a Republican person? And then you can basically take these quantities and from them tease out the amount of sort of latent distrust that comes from partisanship alone. So by abstracting away sort of the direct effect, whatever's left over is due to this sort of latent effect. So then we can measure, okay, folks are sort of inferring that scientists are Democratic, and that's what's driving the trust or distrust. And that's exactly what we did. And it turns out that yes, you sort of recover the expected result. Voters who preferred Trump in the 2020 election, of course, have lower levels of trust for science. Democrats have higher levels of trust. Now, what turns out that's interesting is that it's not sort of an all hope is lost situation. It turns out that the voters who were the least likely to report trust were also the most likely to increase their trust when you were able to convince voters that they should be thinking about another heuristic. We'll call it the expertise heuristic. So if you could convince the folks that these are scientists and they are objective, yes, they're actually going to, yes, they'll have sort of a lower baseline level of trust, but you can actually increase their trust the most. And I think that's sort of the sort of finding that we lean on, and we try to, when we make recommendations, policy recommendations to scientists about how to communicate their work, they should be really leaning into this sort of informational heuristic, the expertise heuristic. Like, let folks know that you've been objective and that there's great evidence to support your claims, and folks really will come along. Like, they will put aside, they'll sort of put aside the partisan valence for a second. And I think that's a nice, hopeful finding. And it's precisely the folks who are the least trustful that are most likely to sort of have their opinion changed. And I think that's a good sign for how we can communicate the science.
Now, one of the things that's been, you mentioned this earlier with respect to a previous project, but one of the things that has been really kind of remarkable over the last 5 or 6 years has been that we've done a whole series of different surveys over time. And many years ago, I don't remember when it was, we first started by asking some simple questions in these surveys about, how much confidence do you have in the following research institutions? How much confidence do you have in these kind of organizations or these kind of individuals? So we've been able to track some of that over time. And I think that the thing that was really interesting, of course, and difficult was that last year was a tough one for science.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Tough one for science funding, for trust in science and trust in scientific institutions. We have some of this data, and then we did a poll in December.
That's right.
What did we find in that December poll?
So, in fact, the level of trust and sort of the favorability for these research institutions, named institutions like Stanford, Harvard, Caltech, has gone up actually since 2022. So as of over the 3-year period, now maybe there's been sort of a generic move towards more trust of institutions in general. That could be a sort of an alternative explanation. It could be that it's the thermostat. So once the administration switched over and took a more aggressive stance against the universities, maybe folks sort of, we call this the thermostatic reaction. People say, no, that's too far. But for whatever the underlying mechanism, we do find that the named institutions are sort of experiencing more public support than they were experiencing 4 years ago. And I think that's a pretty remarkable finding, and not what folks inside of these universities are really sort of thinking about. They're focused a lot on the policy changes and the attacks coming out of Washington, D.C., and not really looking at where the public is. And I actually think that's sort of if you're looking for sort of signs of like, well, how can we sort of rebuild trust in the institutions? Well, we can start there. To take Harvard, for example, I think folks would be surprised to find that Harvard's approval rating was almost 60%. I think it was a 59-40 split in favor of favoring Harvard, in saying that we approve of what, and the specific question wording was, do you believe that these institutions are having a positive effect on the country? So 60% of people said yes, in fact, Harvard is having a positive effect on the country, which is not the sort of, I think, narrative and the messaging that we're receiving given the sort of policy stance that the administration has taken. So, one sort of implication from this finding is that some of these policies are elite-driven and they have not percolated down towards the public. There hasn't been a trickle-down effect with respect to a sort of change in stance about how folks perceive the universities, which I think is a sign that we do produce, independent work that can be, that can encourage, that can earn the trust of the public.
Well, great, and thanks for the chat today. I really appreciate your
thanks,
time.
Mike. Thank you.
Listening to all the fantastic work
this is
you're
really
doing.
exciting.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Mike.